Hi, I am Harold Meyerson. I am the editor-at-large of the American Prospect, the social democratic liberal magazine founded by Robert Reich and Robert Kuttner and Paul Starr. And I am an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. And I am here today with Jack Ross to discuss all kinds of issues raised by the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign and the really kind of surprising initial breakout of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, the really large crowds he's been drawing, and the perhaps unexpectedly good showing in the polls. And I'm talking today with Jack Ross, who has just had a book published which is really the definitive history of the political tradition in America out of which Bernie Sanders emerges, the democratic socialist tradition. So, Jack, why don't you introduce yourself and talk about the book for a minute, and then we can start talking about Bernie.
Okay, yes. I'm Jack Ross, and this is my book, which was released in the spring, Socialist Party of America, Complete History. And as it's happened, the book has proven to be extremely timely now with Bernie Sanders' campaign. And I mean, it's almost impossible to describe this book in just a few seconds. It covers the entire history of the historic American Socialist Party, from its roots at the end of the 19th century to its decline and ultimate fraction to three organizations in the 1970s. And Bernie Sanders doesn't. We might talk a little about what his very tenuous direct organizational tie to this history might be in some of his college activism. It seems to have been a lot more at the margins organizationally in the coverage since his campaign was introduced. Well, I wrote this book. Harold and I have come from a somewhat similar family background in the historic Socialist Party. Harold's parents, I don't know a lot. I'm not sure. I don't think I even know their names offhand, but they were very involved with the historic Socialist Party, and particularly in its twilight after World War II in Los Angeles. And my maternal grandparents were not members of the Socialist Party, but they were important figures in the labor movement in Washington in the 50s and in organizing the CIO. And they had many friends who had been in the Socialist Party. And we might talk a little about some of the historiographical reasons I had for writing the book because of that family background and in the historic non-communist left. And as I got older, realizing how much of the history had come to be defined by memories of the Communist Party, and that after that in addition to many ways in which this led to a misleading picture about much of the history of the period, I certainly felt that a generation after the Cold War that the non-communist left that both Harold and I have our family background in deserved to be reconsidered on its own terms. Now, I guess before we move on, I'll just say very quickly, as that relates to Bernie Sanders. So I mentioned he was at the University of Chicago in the early 1960s. Some of the press reports since he declared his campaign suggest he'd only been peripherally involved with the Young People's Socialist League at the University of Chicago. He was very active in civil rights activism. I talk in the book about a lot of, the book is as much about the American left and historical memory as about the straightforward history of the Socialist Party. I explain in the book, or make my case, why the two subjects necessarily needed to complement each other. So I talk a lot about a lot of the debates or motivations, and Harold, certainly having lived through it along with my parents, who he each knew each respectively, back in the heyday of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. But a lot of the debates had shaped that historical memory. And I guess I hadn't realized until a lot of the coverage of the campaign, until the campaign, or press coverage in the campaign, that Bernie moved to Vermont almost immediately after leaving the University of Chicago, and was just very divorced from things that were from organization, and was really in a different world from a lot of the organizational politics and a lot of what was happening I guess in more elite intellectual and activist circles on the left. And so that separated him from a lot of the politics of that period that I talk about in the book, distorting a lot of historical memory. And I know, because my mother actually has lived in Vermont for the last several years, I know of some other friends of hers I've talked to there, and realizing when I would talk to them about some of these same debates, and they would have only moved to Vermont by the early to mid 70s, but even then, that they were simply away from the scene and in Vermont and establishing lives and organizing there.
Jack, maybe I can pick up some of this stuff from here. By the way, just for what it's worth, in going through the Young People's Socialist League, Bernie Sanders was hitting a point of commonality with a lot of American socialists of many generations. My parents, whom you referenced, actually met in the Young People's Socialist League chapter of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the 1930s, which is probably as good a place as any to do a study of the American left on. But I think in going to Vermont, to a certain degree, and from what I've read of Bernie Sanders' past, there were two kinds of free spirits, as it were, I think, going to Vermont in the wake of the 1960s. The more conventional left spirits, who, as you note, probably by going to Vermont were distancing themselves from the internecine issues that were dividing what there was at that point of an American socialist movement. And more like the free-spirited hippie movement, too, I think, both of which ended up in Vermont, and to a degree, both of which Bernie had a little bit of sympathy with. I mean, this was a time when people coming out of the New Left, which we don't really associate Bernie with, but people coming out of the New Left, a lot of them went to, not a lot of them, but a number of them went to rural communes at the end of the 60s, pretty much as the mainstream anti-Vietnam War left was sort of breaking up and having an identity crisis, which it was at the end of the 60s. That was the solution, if that's the word, of a number of people trying to figure out what to do next. And I think you have a lot of that sort of plunking itself down in Vermont. Now, what's kind of really unusual about Bernie Sanders is not that he, had a socialist, a formal socialist affiliation at some point in the 1960s, but that he maintained this identity and went into politics and got elected with it over the next 40 years. That's I think why we're talking about Bernie Sanders today. And his campaign raises all kinds of interesting questions, not only about its surprising viability so far, but what it means in this day and age to be a democratic socialist, and what aspects of the democratic socialist experience in the United States he seems to still personify and draw from. And I know you talk in the book a lot about a lot about the municipal socialist movements that we think of, in particular with the early 20th century, though in the case of Milwaukee, it extends well into the mid-20th century. Why don't you talk a little about that and about how Bernie may kind of fit into that tradition? If you explain a little about what that tradition actually was.
Well, throughout the first half of the 20th century, mainly before World War I, but in a couple other places in addition to Milwaukee, after World War I, and even into as late as the 1950s as well, you had the Socialist Party did elect many mayors and local officials and even a handful of state legislators, and the key thing to understand about them, some radicals would sometimes refer to them as sewer socialists. That term I think, had a very specific meaning about having to do with, particularly in Milwaukee, about that their big boast was about building modern sewers. But in a lot of these cities, and they were in almost every part, certainly in the 1910s decade, in almost every part of the country. But basically, these were pragmatists. They were, in almost every case, very closely tied to the local labor movement, and basically they owed political success to simply delivering on core constituency service and having a record of clean government. And this being the height of the progressive era in the 1910s, it was very often were first elected into office as a revolt against municipal corruption. And Bernie Sanders grew very much hews to that model. When he was first elected mayor of Burlington, he, of all things, drew his main support beyond his natural constituency from the local police union on account of local controversies going on at the time, and in Congress and the Senate, it also obtains as well. I mentioned my mother has lived in Vermont the last several years. 2 years ago, I went to the 4th of July parade in Warren, Vermont, and first the governor walked by, got somewhat tepid but respectable applause. But then the crowd went absolutely wild for Bernie when he came by, and absolutely wild. And this is a picturesque little mountain town near some of the ritzier ski lodges, and so it's not, in short, where he was elected mayor of Burlington by 10 votes in 1981. And so when you consider this kind of support combined with 70% of the vote, his re-election, I guess, had been a year before this, two things, I think, secured this beyond a natural base, which would have still probably been a small majority in Vermont, one of the most liberal states of the Union, but how that became 70% of the vote, and the absolute pandemonium at 4th of July parade would have been two things. One was being very, very aggressive in delivering on veterans' benefits. He was, after all, chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee while the Democrats still held the Senate, and the other, which has become somewhat controversial or has gotten some media attention in recent days because of the tragedy in Charleston, is his record on Second Amendment rights, which is apparently mixed. I do wonder how much of I had initially been told, and the person who told me this was mistaken, that he had an A rating from the NRA, which he never did. I don't think he ever had more than a C rating for in the coverage that's come out. But I do wonder how much of that reflects simply giving up a ghost of bipartisanship that a lot of these issue for activist groups. So I guess that, in short, is where is the story of Bernie's career and his success, and we will obviously talk about how that model replicates nationally, and when it comes to a campaign on the kinds of issues that he's passionate about.
One of, I think, the smallest state in terms of population. I'm not sure. Wyoming might be smaller, but second to Wyoming. Okay, very different politics from Wyoming. Wyoming is an oil and cattle state, and you don't find many cattle ranches or oil fields in Vermont. But what you do find in Vermont, not to put too fine a point on it, is white folks. It is the whitest state still in the Union, and in large part that's a function of geography and the absence of big cities and the kind of employment opportunities which all kinds of folks might flock to. But as well, I tend to think that Bernie's, let's call it his natural inclination towards socialism, and which in many ways in our time means a clearer appreciation of the dynamics of economic class, of class structure, because honestly, these days, it's not clear to me that socialist economic policy really differs that much from what we might call mainstream progressive economic policy. I'm not sure that Bernie Sanders' platform is all that different from what would have been Elizabeth Warren's platform if she were running. But I think there is a difference in the kind of analysis, and I just would suspect that Bernie's ability to maintain and advance that analysis is partly made easier by the fact that the divisions in a place like Vermont of necessity, given what the state is, are necessarily more those of class than those of race, just because there hardly are any people belonging to any other race except white in Vermont. And I think that that poses an interesting challenge for him. In fact, I've long thought, to really broaden this discussion a bit, I've long thought that your proximity to the Canadian border makes the American version of social democracy easier. Minnesota, Vermont, states that look at universal social welfare programs. The historic obstacle to social welfare programs in the United States has often been that the racial divisions, the attacks on Obamacare, basically come down to, well, it's helping minorities, it's not helping you white folks. That kind of stuff doesn't play where there have been historically more monochromatic populations. And so the class analysis that Bernie has not only is his legitimate belief, but I think reinforced somewhat by the demographics of his state. And you know, I love it's my analysis too, but there are real issues that America is grappling with right now in the wake of the Charleston idiocy that are primarily issues of race. And here, to be honest, someone like Hillary Clinton, who came of age politically in Arkansas, where obviously this is something that you confront daily, might feel on more familiar ground than Bernie would. That's not to take away from Bernie. It's just to say one's life and you know, your viewpoints are often dictated by what your experience has been, and they have two different sets of experiences. So anyway, I've been wandering over a lot of points there. So uh, react or not as you wish, Jack.
Well, they are. They do essentially all um, amount to the same point, and it's an important point, and it's and they are, and actually the question you raise about Bernie and race or identity politics is closely related to your observation about. And I certainly tend to agree. I could mention the things, and maybe it's worth discussing later, that there are some significant differences with Elizabeth Warren I could point out. But I mean, Bernie's speech, his announcement speech, was not a radical speech. It had a core. It had a core message about the economic problems facing the country. I think some characterizations of the speech have been unfair, that he did not touch on about issues he did not touch on, and I certainly could think of things that it might have been good for him to touch on. But overall, I have been impressed. I had initial nervousness about this, but certainly I was impressed that he's taking on the range of issues that he needs to run for president. But basically the speech he gave, just going on his announcement speech, was the speech for, and I do believe it is a much larger constituency than many people realize, that there are many voters, and they probably are not only white voters, but who support a robust left-of-center public policy agenda, but are completely alienated by a lot of the identity politics militancy, whether it has to do with race or sexuality issues that you see that dominate so much of the media now. And I should be clear on that point. I'm not talking about some kind of socially conservative Reagan Democrat Christopher Lasch fantasy when I say that. I'm talking about that same silent majority having what would have been decidedly left of center views on culture war issues just 15 years ago. Now, as far as specifically some of the things he said that have been suggested in the media about Bernie and his short-sightedness of this issue, it was suggested he did not bring up over-policing or prison issues. That certainly I can see the argument for him bringing those up. When I watched the speech, my own disappointment was that he didn't say more about civil liberties questions, NSA Patriot Act, and that's specifically the area where I've been very impressed with the stands he's taken or how out in front he's been since announcing for president or preparing to announce for president. I find it very disingenuous, though, the suggestion that, or certainly the suggestion that Hillary Clinton has a better record between her and her husband's record. And you mentioned the fact that she first became politically active in Arkansas, and I won't rehearse specific things, some of which have come out in connection to all the discussion about the Confederate flags in Charleston. But certainly if you want to go there to what her record was and what the cultural signals were in Arkansas, and that certainly takes it even further back than to simply talk about how in her husband's administration, how that added to and exacerbated prison and over-policing problems. But I think it's also important to say that even if it's not necessarily his intention, Bernie is presenting a challenge to a liberal left that has become so accustomed and increasingly it seems to me even has no concept of how to view these issues such as over-policing or the drug war or civil liberties outside of a racial lens, which certainly.
Well, let me jump in here and disaggregate this a little. We're not saying that the basis of Bernie's appeal is that he's not addressing this not through a racial lens, which certainly has dominated a lot of left discourse, even more than liberal discourse in recent years. But that the key to his popularity, which is real, is his emphasis on cross-cutting economic issues. And the reason I think you can say, as you just did, Jack, that there were a lot of mainstream aspects or non-radical aspects, I think you said, of his speech, is that there is just this growing understanding that isn't really articulated in all parts of the spectrum, but is felt in many parts of the political spectrum, that American capitalism has gone badly awry in recent decades. And I think that's the basis of his connection. It's not what he doesn't say, it's what he does say. Now, you're absolutely right that he doesn't couch this through the perspective of any identity politics, but he's catching on, and I think he'll catch on more because he's addressing, and he really expresses the outrage that many Americans feel at what has happened to the economy and therefore what has happened to their lives. Now, is that sufficient for him to build a significant cross-racial coalition? Well, to begin with, Hillary Clinton has high popularity in a lot of the Democratic Party, through most of the Democratic Party, including minority communities, and understandably, minority communities and others are, you don't have to succumb to the lens of identity politics to be, as you yourself said, concerned by the ongoing institutional and uninstitutional legacies of racism in American life. And these are real issues when you look at the immigration question, when you look at police practices and incarceration rates, and the disproportionately bad effect that this dysfunction of American capitalism has on minorities. So there are, ways to address this that, acknowledge all of those issues, acknowledge all of those concerns, propose some progressive solutions, but which do not in any way really come across as a form of identity politics. But I mean, the surge, the great Bernie surge, if we may call it that, is his really frank confrontation of the ridiculous inequality that the current form of American capitalism is imposing on the rest of the nation.
No, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I mean, there is a separate discussion to have about assumptions about Hillary inevitability, and I mean, it's a separate discussion. I mean, I want to cover the horse race aspect of all this, but politically speaking, what you're saying is certainly right, and maybe I take it too seriously or ascribe to it more power than it deserves. So much of the liberal opinion-making class, or that puts forward these ideas. I mean, I've seen it suggested in a Vox item about Bernie not taking on the prison issue and trying to somewhat weakly argue that Hillary has a better record or better inside track taking on criminal justice reform. This piece in Vox actually said said in discussing other Democrats running or likely running, this piece actually said Jim Webb was, I think in their words, for criminal justice reform before it was cool, but he has talked about reaching out to white working class voters, and so it is unlikely that he would be that candidate. What happens, if only for the sake of argument, what happens, or what does someone like that say if Jim Webb gets in the race and he, for whatever host of reasons, may have a better inside track to competing with Hillary for a black vote than Bernie, and largely on the basis of the criminal justice reform issue? I mean, again, it could very well be that I take this sort of thing too seriously, but to bring it back, what I think is important about Bernie, and again, it's not necessarily his intention, is that he forces the question, and I think Jim Webb would in other ways, but I mean, I had one of my best friends close to a year ago now. We were talking about politics, and I was talking about all of this self-absorption in culture war issues and waging a new culture war offensive. And he said to me, so why then are the biggest issues on the liberal agenda economic inequality, global warming, and prison reform? And I didn't have the most direct or coherent answer to him then, but I think for many of the reasons you say, that simply the urgency of these issues is coming to the fore now, and that is forcing contradictions. I mean, in one column, I know you even went as far as to describe Elizabeth Warren as the leader of American liberalism. I get the sense that I don't know if her importance will fade because of Bernie or whether, or I kept an open mind about her, but I mean, I found it puzzling why, and it certainly seems largely dissipated now, but why there was such a focus on her as the liberal or progressive candidate, and two, obviously the desire, preference for a woman to run against Hillary was a large part of it. But more than that, I feel that she represented having it all for the Democrats, or for a lot of liberals to have that robust left of center policy agenda and not have to make any culture war compromise. And again, we're not talking about we're simply talking about, when I talk about that, I'm only talking about a kind of new culture war offensive, or in the context of a lot of what seems to have lost the last midterm for the Democrats. I will mention, because I alluded to it earlier, two things on economic policy points where I think the substantive policy points, and I could argue what a larger philosophical difference they might represent. Two things that Bernie supports that Elizabeth Warren has been on the record opposing, and one being the audit the Fed bill that was pushed by, I guess, both Ron and Rand Paul, and the other being closing the Import-Export Bank, or is it Export-Import Bank? Anyway, just to mention those. And I guess as long as we're going a little bit into we're touching on the horse race aspects of this, I guess I will say about Hillary is that she is very much the personification, or even apotheosis, of a liberalism that that emerged, I guess, beginning in the 1980s, of combining seamlessly identity politics with. I'm not a fan of I really am not fond of using the term, but just for our purposes, neoliberalism, economics, or Rubinomics, I guess might be a better term for purposes of this discussion. Anyway, and I think because she represents that, and because all the criticisms the very deserved criticisms that can be made of her, really ultimately go back to a certain turn in liberalism. To bring it back to my book, I certainly have some argument. I certainly have some compelling, and I'm sure Harold would agree, provocative arguments about the roots of post-Cold War liberalism. But and I think because her alleged inevitability raises so many obvious questions, they raise the further questions about how did liberalism get to this pass? Now that we know that it got to this pass, how can we begin to articulate a set of organizing principles for a new and different political era?
Well, let me suggest that that era is now somewhat beginning. both the emergence of Elizabeth Warren, not as a presidential candidate, but indeed as certainly a leader and quite possibly the leader of American liberalism, and Bernie Sanders' presidential candidacy, suggest at least that the base of the Democratic Party no longer feels any affinity for the basic tenets of Rubinomics, and that was clear in the administration, the Obama administration, being forced to withdraw the what was likely to be the nomination of Larry Summers as head of the Federal Reserve, and in any number of ways. And then I think we need to acknowledge that the Clintons, both Bill and Hillary, are nothing if not readers of public opinion, and that Hillary has moved. I mean, whether you believe this is sincere or not is an issue, but sincerity, I find, 2 points on this. Sincerity in politics, I think, I don't really regard as mattering that much. I think, you may end up doing things that in your heart of hearts you may not really want to do, but in order to be with the political tide, you do them, and at least by that calculus, I think Hillary has certainly moved to the left of where she was, and where her husband was certainly in the 1990s. And I'm not saying this is as a defense of her, but I think simply description, and the fact that she waffled and then ultimately said she wouldn't vote for the fast track agreement, which just passed through the Senate as we taped this yesterday, is a pretty clear indication of that. As far as sincerity mattering, I mean, to a certain degree, particularly in the appearance, sort of the gestalt that candidates convey, I think one of the things that is bolstering Bernie Sanders is he wins the authenticity award going away in the current field of candidates and in both parties. I mean, simply labeling yourself a socialist suggests that you, in the American context, that you have no hesitation about owning up to your identity, which is often something that American politicians have trouble doing. And his very manner, which is kind of the gruff grandpa on the stump manner, also suggests, I think, a level of authenticity that is serving him well politically, precisely because it's so obviously not politically calculated. It's who he is, particularly when he gets going talking about the economy. So, I mean, you're right, Jack, certainly that the Democratic Party as a whole took a turn in the 80s in responding to Reaganism, which shaped much of the Bill Clinton presidency, and did all kinds of things that most Democrats, if Clinton had it to do over again, would say, no, don't do that. Don't leave derivatives unregulated. Don't repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. Don't go for this mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's been a real shift, and I think that, oddly enough, because of maybe not so oddly enough, because that Hillary is perceived as so inevitable, that has diminished the number of, let's say, more established Democrats who might have jumped into the race, and further opened the door for Bernie Sanders. And I'll tell you, vis-a-vis, the Jim Webbs or whoever, the Martin O'Malleys, and God save us, Lincoln Chafee, who have now, are considering, in the case of Webb, or have now already entered the race, I think Bernie really sucks up all of the oxygen in the room for now for Hillary opposition. I mean, he's such an authentic. Look, if you're not going to vote for Hillary in the Democratic primary process, you consider yourself usually probably somewhere to her left. And Bernie is such an authentic personification of those politics that I think he will emerge when it gets down to a two-candidate race as the second candidate. I don't know that, past Iowa and New Hampshire, that there will even be a third and fourth candidate in the Democratic field.
Well, okay, so I guess to begin with, I think I mean, you're right that about movement to the left as far as it goes, but even without going into all the various scandals about the foundation and all the related things that have come out about the Clintons in the last several months, I don't think those things are unimportant and that they won't mean anything going further. I'm not going to deny that politicians change and evolve with the times, and sometimes for nobler reasons than others. But I'm not going to deny that. But I mean, I can conceive of the ways that Hillary could put to rest a lot of what's said about her and talk about big ideas and have some idea, some theme that would galvanize her campaign and that would be agreeable to a lot of her wealthier or more elite funders. I know John Podesta at one point suggested it might be about a global warming, green economy, and so forth. And I mean, I've thought about the possibility of new urbanism, and the two things are certainly related. But the fact that as it goes on, I mean, I think the thing about her is she's congenitally a woman of no imagination. That she's incapable of anything other than very, very small bore political appeals. Now there are those who argue that that's what people want now, and that that's what sells, and I'm not entirely convinced of that. And so I don't think you should assume that Hillary is an immovable object. I did have a larger point. I certainly do agree about the beginnings and interesting ways that even now, interesting ways that these contradictions are beginning to present themselves. I had more to say beyond just about Hillary, but there is a larger point to make that I think is worth making here, and maybe this can bring it back a little bit to my book. And one thing I found very striking about the way this political season seems to be evolving, and the way a lot of issues that are long overdue. I think back to when I was first becoming seriously interested in politics around 2000 election, and I mean, I won't. I mean, some of my odder associations or assumptions are looking at that period, or first becoming interested in any kind of radical politics. But I mean, the issues that were on the agenda of the third party fringe for much of the 90s and into the early 2000s seem to increasingly be the mainstream issues, and in some ways, even in some cases, like with environmental policy, renewable energy, beyond mainstream. But whether it's whether it's criminal justice reform or ending the drug war, and all the related civil liberties questions. And we certainly shouldn't forget foreign policy either in this discussion, and about how those are becoming the issues on the agenda. And in some ways it affirms a view about the two-party system that I'm not entirely comfortable with. I mean, some people on my book tour have asked me about how I feel about Bernie running as a Democrat. And I've said I don't begrudge him his choice, if for absolutely no other reason than the need for a real debate on the Democratic side. And I think it's going to be an interesting and pleasant irony that there will be a real debate, as opposed to the Republican circus where they really don't disagree about much at all. If Rand Paul is perhaps the exception who proves the rule.
And they also won't get much time to say it, since there'll be 10 of them on the stage.
Exactly. But I mean, I'm sorry if I'm going a little all over the place. I do think it's something that's worth saying about the politics of Bernie running in the Democratic Party and opposite. I've said about writing my book, I talked about both our backgrounds, or family backgrounds, and and coming from that background and wanting to speak for the movements they were part of, that this is to both self-identified socialists. This book is really like something from another planet. And frankly, I've said of Bernie, he represents just enough of a link to that past to raise interesting questions, some of the questions we've talked about. And I mean, when I look at just how far gone the world of the third party left and completely taken over, I mean, it's a long discussion why I would have ever thought or would have ever appeared to be otherwise about, in, I guess, around 2000 era, not completely assumed by the most extreme identity politics or the worst habits of the Leninist sectarian left. I guess I guess that's just something I wanted to add, and something that was worth saying. And I mean, I do think again though that it will be interesting. A lot of supporters of Bernie may be surprised or unsettled in how some of these issues play out and how he responds to them over the course of the campaign. I guess what I'd say on a concluding note is that I think it is contrary to a lot of media expectation, an exciting time when there is a debate that's been needed and looked to be nowhere in sight less than a year ago about where the liberal left is heading and what its future and what its future is. And I can only hope that my book, which now proves to be extremely timely, can inform that debate. Not simply because of Bernie, but because of the historical context of that larger debate that's beginning. And so I'm very glad I'm very glad to have had the opportunity with you to discuss all that.
As am I, and I think your book will be indeed really provide a lot of good context for Bernie's campaign. I, like your father, Jack. You know, when the Socialist Party split up, we went with the group that more or less said, well, we might as well be open socialists in the Democratic Party, and which is sort of de facto, if not necessarily de jure, where Bernie Sanders now finds himself. Despite calling himself an independent, he is running in the Democratic primary. In many ways, this is sort of the logic of if you're a fish, you need to be in the ocean, particularly as, since you pointed out, Jack, the alternatives to that aren't wildly attractive and haven't been for a long time. And this gets, of course, to the structure of the winner-take-all American electoral system, and also to the radical drift to the right of the Republican Party, which virtually necessitates lesser evil voting and for a lot of reasons. But I'm glad we've had this discussion, and I think it provides some context folks won't get in other places for what is really, I think, the one so far surprising, and certainly from our point of view, pleasantly surprising development of this still early 2016 presidential contest, which is the real emergence, getting huge crowds now where he speaks, and doing much better in the polls than people would have thought of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. So thank you, Jack, and onward we go.
Thank you.